Millionaire tech CEO Callum Reid, surrounded by wealth and power, had already grown used to one of the worst pains a person can feel, going through Christmas without really being seen. But that night, while everyone else avoided him out of arrogance, pity, or awkwardness, Jamie, a little boy in worn-out boots, the son of Elise, a humble mother, crossed the snow-covered park, stopped in front of his bench, reached out his hand, and said one simple sentence that would change the fate of all three forever. Callum Reid had always been the kind of man the media pointed to as a shining example of success. He was the CEO of a huge tech company, the owner of a kind of wealth that seemed to have no bottom, and a man whose voice carried weight in rooms where very few people get to speak. But on a freezing December night, just days before Christmas, he wasn't in a luxury penthouse or a mountain resort. He was sitting alone on a snow-covered park bench, his expensive coat fighting against a cold that was coming from the inside out. The city lights flickered in the distance, but to him everything felt far away, like someone had turned down the volume on his own life. Before he became a symbol of power, Callum had just been the boy nobody chose. He grew up in an orphanage where Christmas meant lines of smiling volunteers, generic presents, and at the end of the day, the same empty bed. Year after year, he watched friends get adopted while his name stayed trapped in a manila folder on some overworked social worker's desk. Over time, he learned to swallow his expectations, to lock away the humility of that little boy deep in his chest, and to cover the pain with a quiet arrogance. If nobody wanted him, he'd become big enough to never need anyone. Now, as an adult being applauded everywhere he went, he had the bank account any kid from that orphanage would have dreamed of. And yet, at that time of year, what hurt most was realizing he had no one to go home to. The steam rising from his coffee cooled quickly, just like his plan to pretend he was fine. He stared at the half-frozen lake and imagined families gathering somewhere, trees being lit, laughter filling entire rooms. His place, on the other hand, was far too quiet. What Callum had no idea about was that in that same park, where nothing seemed to be happening, a small turning point was already walking toward him, with light footsteps and a package of cookies in hand. Elise didn't have wealth in the way the world usually measures it, but she carried a humility that warmed more than any blanket. On that same freezing December night, with Christmas getting close, she and her son Jamie were crossing the park with a box of cookies wrapped in simple paper, stopping here and there to offer a bit of sweetness and a bit of attention to people almost nobody sees. When she spotted that man in a sharp suit sitting alone on the bench, she figured he was just waiting for someone who was running late. Jamie, however, noticed the empty expression, the red eyes, the way he seemed to be there but not really present at all. Without asking permission, the boy let go of his mother's hand and walked straight toward the bench, his little boots crunching through the snow. He stopped in front of Callum, tilted his head, and with the simple honesty of a kid who has no idea how powerful his words are, said, "Don't cry, mister, you can borrow my mom." That line cut through the armor of power and subtle arrogance Callum had spent years building around himself. Blushing with embarrassment, Elise hurried over, apologized, and held out a Christmas cookie like she was trying to patch up her son's boldness. If while you're listening to this, you feel this scene tugging a little at your heart, it's worth subscribing to the channel so you can keep following stories like this. Callum could have reacted with coldness, could have stood up, pretended to be in a rush, used the classic excuse of a last-minute meeting. Instead, he stayed where he was, looking at the boy's face and trying to remember the last time someone had offered him something without wanting anything back. Not money, not status, not a favor in return. The phrase, "You can borrow my mom," echoed inside him like a small turning point, stirring exactly that part of his soul he thought had been asleep since the orphanage. That simple gesture, a cookie and a borrowed lap, opened an unexpected crack in his empty Christmas season, as if a locked door had been opened by very small hands. Callum took a deep breath, Jamie's words pounding in his head, and let out a half-smile that surprised even him. Instead of running, he asked if they had already eaten dinner, and, in a sudden mix of loneliness and newly awakened humility, invited mother and son to join him for hot chocolate nearby. Elise hesitated, used to turning down help from people with so much power and wealth, but the look in her son's eyes was asking for that small Christmas gift. A few minutes later, the three of them were walking side by side down the glowing sidewalk, as if this scene had always been part of their routine and not a completely improbable meeting. In the tiny corner cafe, the warm yellow lights made a cozy contrast with the cold outside. Jamie swung his legs from the high chair while he enthusiastically explained how he and his mom separated the cookies they gave away. "The prettiest ones are for the people who look the saddest," he said. He was explaining some exact science. Elise, still a bit self-conscious, talked about work, about the challenge of raising a child alone, about Christmases that were tight on money but overflowing with laughter. Callum listened quietly, realizing that her humility had more warmth than any fireplace in a millionaire's home. Between sips of hot chocolate, the atmosphere began to shift. Jamie's questions drew out real laughter. Elise's stories completely dismantled the image of arrogance he imagined she might have once she realized who he was. And Callum caught himself sharing things he never told anyone. He spoke about the orphanage, about the nights he pretended not to care about Christmas, about the fear of getting close to someone and being left behind again. In that simple cafe, his expensive suit, his title, and his bank account didn't matter. What took over the scene was something he thought he had lost forever, the feeling of belonging somewhere. What he didn't know yet was that this seemingly casual encounter had roots much older than any of them could imagine. A few days after that unlikely night at the corner cafe, still in the same Christmas season, life seemed to have settled back into place for Elise. Between kids' rehearsals, tight budget spreadsheets, and taking care of Jamie, she almost convinced herself that meeting a man with that much wealth and power had just been a little year-end gift from life. One cold afternoon, while she was organizing old boxes in the tiny office of the theater project, a dusty folder fell to the floor and spilled a pile of yellowed papers. They were records from the time her mother had worked as a social worker, dealing with the kinds of cases nobody wanted to take. Elise started flipping through the documents with a mix of nostalgia and pain. Among reports, faded photos, and forgotten Christmas letters, one familiar name grabbed her attention. Callum Reid, written by hand in her mother's slightly slanted script. The file described a quiet boy scarred by a long line of failed adoptions who had spent a few days living in their home back in 1999 after some trouble at the orphanage. Stapled to the last page was a simple drawing, a reindeer with a red nose holding a little sign that said, "Merry Christmas," the same drawing Elise remembered putting into that boy's suitcase before he left. Her heart started racing. It wasn't just a random name match. The dates lined up, and the descriptions did too. Little by little, the memory of that silent boy sitting on their old couch, staring at the Christmas tree with a mix of defensive arrogance and wounded humility, came back as if someone had switched on an old light. When she met Callum again in the park, folder in hand, she carefully told him what she had discovered. He listened in silence and, after a long breath, admitted, "I kept that reindeer drawing for years. It was my only proof that, at least once, somebody really saw me." In that moment, they both realized this reunion wasn't just a pretty Christmas twist. It was a story that had started a long time ago and was nowhere near finished. When Elise took over as director of the Children's Theatre Project, she didn't gain any kind of material wealth, but she took on a quiet kind of power. She was giving a voice to kids almost nobody listened to. The plays talked about family, courage, humility, about Christmases that hurt and Christmases that heal. That light was exactly what bothered an ex-colleague. someone who had always looked at her work with resentful arrogance, as if someone else's talent was some personal attack. At a decisive meeting with sponsors, he showed up with a cold smile and a ready-made accusation. He claimed the script for the new play wasn't hers at all, but a cleverly disguised plagiarism. The word plagiarism hit the room like somebody had killed the lights. In just a few days, polite emails started rolling in. "We're going to suspend our support until everything is clarified," they said. Elise felt, in her own skin, how the lack of money could squeeze the Christmas of dozens of kids who had been counting on that show as their only real celebration of the year. Some friends pulled away so they wouldn't get involved. Others said they understood, but begged her to be patient. She, who had always believed humility was a strength, suddenly felt small in front of the cold machine that eats reputations alive. What hurt most wasn't that people doubted her. It was the hidden message behind it all. Simple people can be thrown away fast. When Callum found out, he didn't react like some distant CEO making decisions over a glass table. He went to the little theater and saw the empty chairs, the unfinished sets, the kids' drawings taped to the walls with cheap tape. In that space, his wealth looked out of place and absolutely necessary at the same time. Without making a fuss, he put his legal team to work, tearing the accusation apart piece by piece, tracking dates, drafts, and proof of authorship. In a turning point that would have made his younger orphan self proud, he used his own power not to crush someone, but to protect someone who had always walked with humility. The day of the hearing was more tense than any opening night. Elise was shaking on the stand, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes in the room. Across from her, the ex-colleague wore the usual mask of arrogance, of someone who's always believed that people with little money will never really be able to fight back. But the truth had weight of its own. Old emails, drafts, testimonies from kids and parents, records of the creative process, everything lined up on her side. When the judge ruled in her favor, the relief didn't come out in cheers. It came out as quiet tears. The accuser walked out with his head down, and some of the sponsors, embarrassed, started calling again, offering good conversations about restarting their partnership. On the way out, in the cold hallway of the courthouse, it was Callum who grabbed her shoulders when her knees almost gave way. Elise was crying, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was the cry of someone who, for the first time in a long time, felt truly protected. He didn't give a big speech about justice. He just stayed there, steady, and that was worth more than any speech. If hearing this part of the story reminds you of some injustice you've lived through, or of someone who stood up for you in a hard moment, you can share it in the comments. Sometimes sharing those memories creates a kind of ongoing Christmas, where pain finds shelter in someone else's experience, and life quietly gets ready for the next chapter. A few days after the hearing, with Christmas getting closer, Jamie's routine turned into a small battlefield. At school, the news that a man with so much wealth and power was helping the theatre project spread through the hallways like end-of-year gossip. At first, it was just curious questions. Then came the mean jokes. "So, are you going to get rich now too? If this guy likes you so much, why doesn't he just become your dad already?" They were comments thrown out with that childish arrogance that has no idea where it's really hitting. Jamie tried to swallow it all with a half smile, but every sentence hit the exact place where he hurt the most: the empty chair in the audience, the missing place at the Christmas parties, the blank space on the school forms. At home, Elise did everything she could with humility and creativity to keep Christmas from turning into one big comparison game. She made improvised hot chocolate, taped drawings on the wall, and planned a simple holiday dinner. But there's a kind of emptiness that even the tightest hug can't fill by itself. That afternoon, after hearing, "Not even at Christmas do you have a dad to watch you at the theatre," something inside him spilled over. Instead of taking the usual way home, he turned right in silence and headed toward the park where everything had started. The sky was already beginning to darken. The Christmas lights on the lampposts snapped on one by one, giving the icy air a party look. Jamie walked to the same bench where he had once offered his mother on loan to a sad stranger, sat down, wrapped his arms around his knees, and stared at the half-frozen lake. Deep down, he was testing something he didn't yet know how to put into words. Was there really someone who waited for him somewhere? Or was everyone just passing through his life like decoration that disappears once the holidays are over? That's how Callum found him. He had gone to the park to clear his head after a long day of meetings where his wealth felt too big on the outside and too small on the inside. When he recognized the boy's coat and the way he sat hunched on the bench, a tightness in his chest pulled him straight back to his own past. He sat down beside him in silence, letting time stretch out between them. Only after a few minutes did he hear Jamie whisper, still staring at the lake, "I wanted to see if anyone was still waiting here." Callum pulled him into a firm hug, not the hug of power, but the hug of presence, and answered with a voice that almost broke, "I'm here. And your mom is too. You don't have to prove anything to anybody." That sentence didn't fix everything, but it pointed straight toward the Christmas Eve that was almost there. On Christmas Eve, the small apartment where Elise and Jamie lived smelled like cinnamon, something baking and simple hot chocolate. She had put together a modest dinner, the kind where humility turns a little into enough. There was a main dish carefully arranged on the plate, a few improvised sides, and a dessert made out of whatever the budget could handle. There was no sign of great wealth, no magazine-perfect decorating, but every detail carried the effort of a mother who didn't want her son to feel like he had less Christmas than everyone else. Even so, the empty corner of the living room with no tree kept insisting that something was missing. Elise tried to compensate with lightness. She told him that real Christmas was the two of them being together, that the tree, the presents, and the lights were just props. Jamie nodded, but a child's heart sees with its eyes first. He walked over to the window and watched the lights in the neighboring buildings, the shadows of families moving behind the curtains, the contrast between the noise out there and the silence in here. Right in the middle of that picture, the memory of the park came back, the bench, the hug, the promise. "I'm here," returning like a quiet turning point. Part of him wanted to believe this night would be different. Another part was already protecting itself so it wouldn't get hurt again. When the doorbell rang, they looked at each other in surprise. They weren't expecting anyone. Elise's heart started pounding as she wiped her hands on the dish towel and walked to the door. When she opened it, Callum was standing there, with no suit, no posture of power, just a man in a winter coat and a shy smile. In his hands, he held a small, decorated Christmas tree, the kind that can fit in any corner and completely change the atmosphere of a room. Beside it, he had a bag with a few simple boxes, wrapped without any showiness. He stepped inside slowly, like he was asking for permission with his eyes, and set the tree on a little table by the window. When he plugged in the lights, tiny glowing dots spread across the wall and reflected in Jamie's eyes. The boy stood there for a few seconds, checking if what he was seeing was real, until he blurted out straight from the heart, "Mister, maybe you don't have to borrow my mom anymore. Stay." There was no arrogance in that sentence, only a deep request for someone to finally choose to stay for real. Callum took a deep breath, feeling the sweet weight of that choice. He could have joked, dodged, promised to think about it. Instead, he stepped closer, placed his hand on Jamie's shoulder and said, "I'm not borrowing anymore. I'm staying." The simple dinner suddenly felt bigger with one more plate at the table. The conversation started off shy and slowly warmed up, mixing childhood memories, orphanage stories, little victories from school, and bursts of laughter that began to break the usual silence in that house. For Callum, it felt like the first Christmas where he wasn't just surviving the holiday, but actually living it fully. As the weeks went by after that Christmas, the theatre project Elise led started to breathe again with full lungs. With the injustice undone and the sponsor's trust returning, she allowed herself to write something more intimate. It was a play called The Boy and the Borrowed Light. In the story, a child marked by a lot of darkness discovers that when his own light seems to have gone out, sometimes he needs to accept someone else's light until his own inner wealth shines again. It wasn't a story about money. It was a story about humility, about setting aside pride and arrogance so that someone can get close. Jamie was chosen for the lead role. At rehearsals, he memorized lines that sounded like they had been taken straight from his own life. He spoke about the fear of being left behind, the shame of not having a dad in the audience, and the surprise of finding someone willing to stay. Elise watched him step onto the simple stage, surrounded by hand-painted scenery, and felt that this script had more power than a lot of polished speeches. Callum, almost always sitting in the front rows during final rehearsals, watched in silence, realizing that every line touched some old wound of his. It hit him especially hard when he remembered how he had once kept a single Christmas drawing as proof that he wasn't completely invisible. On the night of the performance, the small auditorium filled up. Parents, neighbors, friends, people from the neighborhood, everyone packed into the seats. The lights went out, the chatter faded, and when the spotlight landed on Jamie, the room fell silent. In one of the strongest scenes, the character looked out at the crowd and said, "When you get lost in the dark, you can borrow someone's light until yours starts shining again." For a second, Jamie's eyes drifted to the first row, where Callum and Elise were sitting side by side. The CEO felt a lump rising in his throat, and understood with almost painful clarity that Elise had been that borrowed light for him, and now he was also lighting the path for both of them. After the show, it was late and the air outside was still cold, but the nearby park was still glowing with the colorful lights the city kept on until the end of the Christmas season. Instead of each one heading straight home, the three of them walked together to the same bench where everything had started. First, it had been a CEO sitting there alone. Later, it became the place where a boy offered his mother on loan to a sad stranger. Then it turned into the place of a hug that became a promise on Christmas Eve. Now they were coming back, no longer as strangers, but as people who had chosen to stay in each other's lives. Jamie was carrying something in his hands, protected inside a cardboard folder. When they sat down, he took a deep breath and handed the drawing to Callum. It was a simple sheet of paper colored with crayons, showing the three of them together under those same park lights. He was in the middle, holding a hand on each side, with the bench in the background. There was no mansion, no yacht, no symbols of great power, just three people sharing the same place. Callum looked at the drawing for a few seconds, feeling the same quiet impact he had once felt years before with that reindeer drawing he'd been given as a boy. Elise watched in silence, knowing that piece of paper was saying what no conversation could ever fully explain. Callum took her hand, then Jamie's, copying what he saw in the drawing. He stayed like that for a few moments, letting his heart catch up with the scene, and then said, with a voice rough from emotion, "You were right, Jamie. I'm not borrowing anymore, I'm staying." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was a full silence, heavy with belonging and a kind of wealth you can't measure in numbers, the certainty that he finally had a place to come back to when the Christmas lights go out and the year moves on. Deep down, this story isn't just about a famous CEO, a humble mother, and a boy who changes the course of one Christmas. It's about anyone who, at some point in life, has felt like they were sitting alone on an invisible bench. On the outside, everything in order. On the inside, a kind of emptiness no amount of wealth can fill. Callum had power, prestige, a packed schedule. What he didn't have was someone who would say, "I'm here," even after the lights go out. And it's exactly when he allows himself to accept that borrowed lap that the biggest turning point happens. The strong one stops being the person who doesn't need anyone and becomes the one who has the courage to stay. The person watching this might not be a millionaire, but they understand the fear of not being chosen, of always being the one who fixes everything for everyone else and never really feels seen. There might be a bit of defensive arrogance inside, that inner voice that says, "I don't need anyone," just so you don't run the risk of being rejected again. At the same time, there might be a part of you that wants exactly what Callum found: a simple place, an imperfect table, a Christmas with no luxury, but with people who wait for you to arrive. The question that remains is this: which side of this story do you see yourself in most right now? In the loneliness of the bench, in the humility of the one who offers light, or in the courage of the child who says what no adult dares to say? If this story stirred up some memory, it's worth not letting that feeling die when the video ends. You can bring it into your real life in a very concrete way. Maybe it's time to send a message to someone who slipped into your past, to accept help in a place where you've always resisted, or even to be that borrowed light for someone who looks fine on the outside but is falling apart on the inside. What kind of wealth do you want to build from here on out? The kind that only shines in photos, or the kind that holds up a whole Christmas when everything goes dark? Share in the comments what touched you the most. A detail, a line, a scene. Sometimes one person's confession becomes another person's courage. And if this story truly made sense to you, it's worth sticking around. There are a lot of people who need to hear that they're not alone, and every new video here will be another invitation to look past appearances, past money, and past the arrogance that hides behind the mask of strength. So if you want to keep walking with us through stories like this, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and let the algorithm know that these stories matter to you. The next time Christmas comes around, or the next time your heart feels heavy, even if it's nowhere near December, maybe it'll be one of these stories that reminds you there's always a bench, a light still on, and someone willing to stay.